Last night, many of you may have attended Sheriff Wiggins' town hall meeting over at the community center, and some of you may have gotten a little preview of what you're about to see tonight when Gayle Trotter spoke for just a couple of minutes over at the community center. Well, after the meeting, Gayle was kind of mobbed like a rock star, and people were saying, how did we get you to come to Steamboat? This is so great. We're so happy to have you here. And it turns out that the way we got Gayle to come to Steamboat, our good fortune, was through our mutual friend, Jenny Thomas. Many of you may remember that Jenny spoke at our Freedom Conference in 2010. You might remember she was the kickoff luncheon speaker. And for those of you who might not know who Jenny Thomas is, her husband, you will know, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. So Jenny has become a good friend of mine personally and of the Steamboat Institute and of Gayle, and it was Jenny who introduced us via email after I saw Gayle's tremendous testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I got in touch with Gayle, asked her if she would come out here. Elk River Guns was kind enough and generous enough to sponsor and cover the expenses associated, and so this is how we have Gayle here tonight. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Gayle Trotter. Gayle is a senior fellow with the Independent Women's Forum, and if you're not familiar with the Independent Women's Forum, it is a nonprofit research group whose mission is to expand the conservative coalition. They do a lot of good work. You really should check out their website. I believe it's iwf.org. They've been doing very good work for many years. Gayle is also the co-founder of Schaefer and Trotter, which is a law firm in Washington, D.C., that she and her father built. Last November, as if running a law firm and being a senior fellow with the Independent Women's Forum isn't enough, Gayle decided to throw her hat in the ring and run for an elected office in Washington, D.C., and she was elected to the neighborhood Advisory Neighborhood Commission. So she is a representative from her neighborhood, and she showed us today at lunch some wonderful pictures of she and her children out campaigning, going door to door. And I'll just throw in there, too, that not only is she an elected official in Washington, D.C., and a lawyer and a senior fellow with the Independent Women's Forum, she and her husband also have 6 beautiful kids. I will also tell you that then Gayle's life, I would say, changed on January 30th, fair to say, when she had the courage to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on proposed gun legislation, and many of you have seen the video of Gayle very bravely sitting there talking to senators and telling them, well, let me just read to you, as reported in the Daily Beast website, which many of you may be familiar with. The Daily Beast said, the D.C. lawyer and mother of 6 shocked many when she told a Senate hearing that guns are, quote, the great equalizer for women, and that gun control is effectively sexist. Her column, you might have seen her column called A Woman's Right to Choose Self-Protection. That was published on the Daily Caller website and here in our own Steamboat Pilot in Today back on, I believe it was March 3rd or 4th. I might point out that if you read these articles online in the Steamboat Pilot, Gayle's column, I think, is in the top 3 for the year so far to date in the number of comments received in online editorial pieces. So, having said all of that, let's give a warm Steamboat welcome to the brave and talented Gayle Trotter.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that very too kind introduction, and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules tonight to come and listen to this very important topic. You know you've hit a nerve when the mainstream media, including the New York Times, uses its lead editorial to scold your ideas for being dangerous. This is the same newspaper, mind you, that takes pride in publishing military and state secrets when they feel it's politically expedient to do so. Just another ironic day at the office for the old gray lady. The truth is, the Times and other liberal elites were shocked to see a Washington, D.C. lawyer and mother of 6 tell members of the United States Congress that guns are the great equalizer for women, and consequently that newly proposed gun control measures would have a disparate impact on women. The big government liberal elites especially took offense when I said that millions of American women want their legislators to safeguard a woman's right to choose to exercise her Second Amendment rights to protect herself. A woman's ability to arm herself for her own protection is even more consequential than for a man because guns are the great equalizer in a violent confrontation. We preserve meaningful protection for women by safeguarding our Second Amendment rights. And lawful self-defense is a central component of the Second Amendment, which I know I don't have to tell you all that. For its first hearing of 2013, the Senate Judiciary Committee convened to discuss a question: what should America do about gun violence? We all want a safer society. People differ on how or whether a particular proposal may increase public safety in a nation where private owners already have roughly 300 million guns. Here's my answer. First, what America should do is preserve and defend the Bill of Rights. Second, what America should not do is pursue bad policies based on fear-mongering and elite demagoguery. Third, we should not allow our legislators to engage in self-defeating gestures that sound attractive but have perverse effects. Our political leaders should reject proposals that not only will fail to make Americans safer, but will harm women the most. The truth is that women can, and often do, use firearms to defend themselves and their loved ones against violent attacks. In this talk, I'll cover 3 points. First, I have some observations about the history, the meaning, and the purpose of the Second Amendment. Second, the facts about private gun ownership and public safety, I'll discuss those. And third, I have observations about the role of ideology and bias in this debate. For some reason, the anti-gun crowd conveniently overlooks the fact that the Second Amendment is part of our Bill of Rights. We all know how big government liberals like their judges to invent new rights that appear nowhere in the Constitution. Their euphemism for this practice is to say that the Constitution is a living document, but that's just hype. There are parts of the Constitution that they want to kill. For those provisions, big government liberals want their judges to make parts of our Constitution disappear without a trace and airbrush them out of our history. There's no better example of this than the Second Amendment. Like it or not, armed citizens founded this nation. And when they did, the founders enshrined gun ownership among the civil liberties enumerated in our Bill of Rights. Yet for opponents of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms is an embarrassing oddity. A quirky anachronism they might grudgingly concede, if pressed, applies only to flintlock muskets. History dispels that myth. From the outset, the Second Amendment existed to protect citizens against tyranny by ensuring their right to gun ownership. Alexander Hamilton, he might be in that picture, said that an armed citizenry is the best and only real defense against forces of tyranny. He wrote in Federalist 29 that the best possible security against a standing army is a large body of citizens, little at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. James Madison said that the people have ultimate authority and would develop plans of resistance in response to ambitious encroachments of the federal government. We've had a few of those recently, right? He observed in Federalist 46 that the free and gallant citizens of America, unlike the people of almost every nation, have the advantage of being armed. As a result, the Second Amendment guarantees to the people the right to keep and bear arms. Unlike other individual rights, this one appears in the Constitution's literal text. The Bill of Rights guarantees a right of the people only 2 other times, both of which clearly describe individual rights. The First Amendment protects the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government, and the Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people against unreasonable searches and seizures. In lieu of empty, self-defeating gestures, we should address gun violence by doing what works. By safeguarding our Second Amendment rights, we preserve meaningful protection for women. Our nation made significant progress in that regard when, in recent memory, the United States Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense in the home. First, the court held in 2008, in the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. In a parallel case 2 years later, in 2010, the court held that the Second Amendment applies to the states as well as the federal government. For those who believe in safeguarding the civil liberties enshrined in our Bill of Rights, you might consider this an unremarkable conclusion. The constitutional text expressly guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, and that right is specifically enumerated, not implied, but guaranteed to the people. In other words, unlike many of the individual rights that the Supreme Court has recognized, some would say invented, you can actually find the right to bear arms in the literal text of the Second Amendment. Moreover, the Constitution guarantees a right of the people only 2 other times, both of which clearly describe individual rights. Again, the First Amendment protects the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government, and the Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people against unreasonable searches and seizures. That was not enough for the liberal dissenters. They decried the court's announcement of a new constitutional right to own and use firearms for private purposes. Ironically, this claim originated from those who agree with the judicial philosophy that has discovered new fundamental individual rights hiding within penumbras that are formed by emanations from specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights. Adherents to this view, and I am not making this up, maintain that the Bill of Rights generates penumbral emanations that create assorted individual rights. Even so, they simultaneously claim that enforcing an individual right expressly written in the black letter of the text, the constitutional text, is the announcement of a new constitutional right. Let's see here. Shadowy secretions reveal the hidden meanings of rights secretly embedded in the Constitution and awaiting judicial divination. But a specifically enumerated guarantee in the Bill of Rights is a new constitutional right? Okay, got it. But wait, there's more. The dissenting justices claimed that a local law could ban private possession of any form of operable firearm because the adjacent states, they do permit the use of handguns for target practice, and those states were only a brief subway ride away. They called this a minimal burden on the Second Amendment right to bear arms, as if a law-abiding citizen who is facing down a violent attacker could somehow coax the violent attacker to go on the subway with them to a nearby jurisdiction, target range, and be able to defend themselves. So here's a judicial philosophy that purports to allow restrictions on individual liberties as long as a brief subway ride would transport an aggrieved citizen to another jurisdiction where the rights are not similarly restricted. It's not hard to imagine that these same judges would require greater protection of the rights that they invented. You know, the rights that flow from penumbras formed by emanations. All of this is quite far afield of where we began with our founding fathers. The advantage of being armed, Madison said, is one that the American people possess over the people of almost every other nation. And the best possible security against a police state, according to Hamilton, is a large body of citizens ready to defend rights and those of their fellow citizens. The divide between conservative and liberal Supreme Court justices shows us 2 dramatically different views of our Bill of Rights. One approach has repeatedly created new rights found nowhere in the Constitution, while unflinchingly limiting the Second Amendment's right of the people to keep and bear arms to protect only the right to have a gun in the Army, as vacuous as that would be. The other approach, which has twice prevailed in the Supreme Court, takes seriously the people's enumerated rights, the ones actually written in the Constitution, and upholds the Second Amendment rather than airbrushing it from history. With this in mind, let's turn to the facts about private gun ownership and public safety. Consider the compelling story of Sarah McKinley. Some of you may have heard this in my testimony, but for those who haven't, I would like to share it again because it really touched me as a mother of 6 children. Home alone with her baby, Sarah McKinley called 911 when 2 violent intruders began to break down her front door. The men wanted to force their way into her house to gain access to the prescription drugs of her recently deceased husband. He had recently died of cancer. But before the police could arrive, while Sarah was still on the line with the 911 operator, these violent intruders broke down her door. One of the men brandished a foot-long hunting knife. As the intruders forced their way into her home, McKinley fired her weapon, fatally wounding one of the violent attackers and causing the other to flee the scene. Later, Sarah McKinley reflected on the incident. It was either going to be him or my son, and it wasn't going to be my son. Guns make women safer. It's an uncomfortable fact for opponents of the Second Amendment. Guns reverse the balance of power in a violent confrontation. This is especially the case because over 90% of violent crimes, over 90%, occur without a firearm. And this is according to the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. That study noted that the percent of violent victimizations involving firearms has remained generally stable in recent years. So this is nothing new. How do guns give women the advantage in a violent confrontation? Armed with a gun, a woman can even have the advantage over a violent attacker. An armed woman does not need superior strength. She doesn't have to have the proximity of a hand-to-hand struggle. She can protect her children. She can protect elderly relatives. She can protect herself and others who are vulnerable to attack. Using a firearm with a magazine holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition, a woman would have a fighting chance even against multiple attackers. Concealed carry laws help reverse that balance of power even before a violent confrontation occurs. For a would-be criminal, concealed carry laws dramatically increase the risk of committing a crime because criminals can't tell ahead of time who has a weapon and who doesn't. For a potential victim, carrying a gun enhances the ability for her to defend against a violent attack. These two effects indirectly benefit even those who do not carry, with demonstrable results on crime statistics, as documented by economist John Lott. For example, among the 10 states that adopted concealed carry laws over a 15-year span, there were 0.89 shooting deaths and injuries per 100,000 people, less than half of the 2.09 per 100,000 people experienced in states that did not adopt these concealed carry laws. In my Senate testimony, I provided a detailed summary of recent news accounts selected from the last 12 months. Each of these accounts involved a woman who, like Sarah McKinley, used a firearm to protect herself or a loved one against violent men. These examples included a woman who defended herself against 5 burglars, a woman who thwarted an attempted shooting in a school, a woman who saved her child from a kidnapper, a woman who stopped a gunman in a movie theater, and 18 other examples of women using firearms in self-defense. These types of news accounts almost never gain national attention despite their prevalence. Private citizens account for more than 1/3 of all instances where a violent criminal is killed during the commission of a felony. Now, this is according to a recent Justice Department study on U.S. homicide trends. Americans use firearms defensively 2.2 to 2.5 million times a year, according to a study by criminologist Gary Kleck. This is based, oh, I didn't even notice I was down. Can you all hear me okay? So the Americans use the firearms 2.2 to 2.5 million times a year to defend themselves against violent criminals. And this is according to a criminologist, Gary Kleck, who's a lifelong Democrat. He's a member of the ACLU, and he says he's a contributor to liberal democratic causes. But you won't hear any of these statistics from the mainstream media. So let me repeat them just one more time. Eric Holder's Justice Department says that private citizens account for more than 1/3 of all instances where a violent criminal is killed during the commission of a felony. Gary Kleck, who's a card-carrying ACLU member, mind you, calculates that up to 2.5 million instances of defensive gun use happen annually by private citizens. Research has found that reduced gun ownership results in increased criminal home invasions and the lethality of these attacks on law-abiding citizens. John Lott's research shows that homeowners who defend themselves make burglars generally wary of breaking into homes. Of course, right? That's simple logic. Similar to the concealed carry phenomenon, that creates spillover effects, or what economists would call external benefits, from the fact that in both cases, criminals cannot know in advance who has the means to defend themselves. During the Senate hearing, Senator Chuck Grassley asked me why a semi-automatic rifle, such as an AR-15, has value as a weapon of defense. I responded that AR-15s are accurate, they have good handling, they are light, they are easy for women to hold, and yes, I highlighted their scary appearance. Just a few days after that, a New York Times report on the AR-15 cited similar benefits. They called the rifle fast, modern, ergonomically designed, relatively easy to handle. They noted that it produces little recoil and highlighted its appearance as something that commandos might carry. When the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home, the court indicated that the right covers weapons that are typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes. The AR-15 satisfies that standard, considering that there are 2.4 million to 3.3 million AR-15s owned by law-abiding American citizens right now. At no point did the Supreme Court suggest that citizens are limited only to weapons that would provide a merely adequate ability to protect their families. That's the standard Senator Sheldon Whitehouse suggested, just an adequate ability. Meanwhile, gun rights opponents continue to cite the same discredited studies to claim that private gun ownership does more harm than good. For example, one study by Arthur Kellerman of Emory University used data gathered from homicide victims' relatives who were asked if the deceased owned a gun in the home. The study gave the misleading impression that the same gun had been used in the killings. In fact, of the 444 homicides studied in his 1993 paper, only 8 deaths resulted from guns that were in the homes. Kellerman himself reported that most of the deaths did not even involve a firearm at all, with the majority resulting from a knife or some other sharp instrument, that was 26.4%. The remaining victims were bludgeoned, 11.7%, strangled, 6.4%, or by other means, 5.7%. Moreover, Kellerman's research counted a benefit from defensive gun use only where a criminal had been killed or injured, ignoring the fact that attackers are killed or injured in less than 1% of defensive gun use. I'll say that again. The criminals are injured or killed in less than 1% of defensive gun use. This is just one example, but the list goes on and on. A detailed and scholarly feminist critique of gun control by Inga Larish concluded that gun control proponents ignore statistical evidence of actual civilian gun use and fail to reduce violent crime against women. Larish's study concluded that gun control measures disproportionately harm women by restricting or removing the most effective method of self-defense available. We know that armed security works. That's why brave men and women stand guard over banks, airports, rock concerts, and government buildings. Snipers stand guard on the White House roof. Politicians and other high-profile individuals, including prominent gun control advocates, have been shown to have gun permits either currently or in the past. While armed security works, gun bans do not. Anti-gun legislation keeps guns away from the sane and the law-abiding, but it does not keep guns out of the hands of criminals. Nearly all mass shootings have occurred in gun-free zones. Law-abiding citizens do not bring guns to gun-free zones, so psychotic killers know they can inflict more harm in these unprotected environments. These laws make easy targets of the sane and the law-abiding. Gun control advocates cheer the creation of legally mandated gun-free zones, touting increased safety while actually making citizens in those locations more vulnerable to the next horrible monster in search of soft targets. A moment's reflection confirms that statutory provisions and bold signs do not create a gun-free environment. No sober-minded person would advocate that approach while protecting banks, airports, rock concerts, and government buildings. Instead, publicly designated gun-free zones have the effect of creating high-visibility soft targets, conspicuous environments where madmen can wreak havoc. We need sensible enforcement of the gun laws that are already on the books. Currently, we have more than 20,000 under-enforced or selectively enforced gun laws. Gun regulation affects only the guns of the law-abiding. Criminals are not bound by these gestures, especially as we continually fail to prosecute serious gun violations or provide meaningful and consistent penalties for violent felonies involving firearms. That brings me to my third and final point, the role of ideology and bias in the gun debate. Politicians and celebrities want to prevent law-abiding citizens from using guns to protect themselves, but they feel entitled to claim that privilege for themselves. Consider the fact that armed guards often serve in the employ of those who themselves advocate for more restrictions on gun rights. Politicians and celebrities seek to restrict gun rights. Hollywood actors somberly urge Americans to demand a plan to reduce gun violence, despite their own roles in graphically depicting lethal violence on the screen. In both instances, many of these politicians and celebrities already have a plan to reduce the threat of gun violence in their lives. They rely on guns to safeguard their own personal safety. It's all too typical for gun rights critics themselves to face exposure for relying on firearms for their own personal protection. For example, armed guards protected a suburban newspaper in New York after the newspaper published the names and residential addresses of gun permit holders. Separately, the newspaper's own reporter was shown to use a gun for his protection. After publishing the story, the editors disclosed that their reporter owns a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum and has a residence permit in New York City. Medical politicians, too, they like to sound the alarm about the dangers of guns. Yet many more people die each year from the physician's own negligence than from guns. The medical literature on gun control generally betrays its own anti-gun bias. Analyzing the claims of Kellerman, the study I referred to earlier, and others, Edgar Suter, who's a physician, has documented wholesale faulty methodologies, false citations, fabricated data, and overt mendacity in the medical literature on guns, finding a remarkable failure of peer review. Suter's expose cited a Harvard study finding that physicians' negligence kills annually 3 to 5 times as many Americans as guns. Based on that study, Suter concluded that, with sad irony, it has become vogue for medical politicians to claim that guns, rather than medical negligence, have become a public health emergency. The phrase, "physician, heal thyself," comes to mind. Reminiscent of reporting on shark attacks, media coverage has much more to do with sensationalism than with real-world danger. For example, residential swimming pools are far more dangerous to children than firearms. I don't have a pool for that reason. Reams of research have found that reduced gun ownership results in increased criminal home invasions and lethality of attacks on law-abiding citizens. Economist Stephen Levitt wrote in his best-selling book, Freakonomics, that the likelihood of death by pool is 1 in 11,000 versus death by gun, which is 1 in 1 million plus. It isn't even close. Levitt calculated that a child is roughly 100 times more likely to die in a swimming accident at a house with a pool than in gunplay at a house with a firearm. 100 times more likely. Gun regulations in my hometown, the District of Columbia, are in an absurd state. NBC's David Gregory inadvertently demonstrated as much when he displayed a 30-round magazine on national television and thereby embroiled himself in a police investigation. Ultimately, the DC Attorney General decided not to prosecute the matter. Quote, "Despite the clarity of the violation of this important law," he concluded, "a prosecution would not promote public safety." Why is it permissible to possess magazines to persuade people that guns are dangerous, but not for a woman to possess one to defend herself against home invasion or gang rape? It's a puzzler. Overbroad anti-gun regulations unduly increase prosecutorial discretion and result in selective enforcement of the law. Equal justice under law should not depend on whether a prosecutor has a political or ideological motivation to seek enforcement. Nor should justice depend on whether a prosecutor has the good sense to decline enforcement of a knowing violation that does nothing more than unwittingly demonstrate the absurdity of the gun laws. Millions of American women care deeply about their Second Amendment rights. We want to protect a woman's right to choose to protect herself and her loved ones from violent attackers. To paraphrase James Madison, the free and gallant women of America, unlike the people of almost every other nation, have the advantage of being armed. Those who care about women's well-being should work to safeguard our rights to keep and bear those types of firearms typically possessed by law-abiding citizens to protect ourselves and our families because nearly all violent crimes occur without firearms, making guns the great equalizer for women defending against violent attack. Guns make women safer. The Supreme Court has recognized that lawful self-defense is a central component of the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to keep and bear arms. For women, the ability to arm ourselves for our protection is even more consequential than for men, because guns are the great equalizer in a violent confrontation. As a result, we preserve meaningful protection for women by safeguarding our Second Amendment rights. As I told the U.S. Senate, every woman deserves a fighting chance. Thank you.
Could you please address the UN Small Arms Treaty that is being sometimes considered by our elected officials?
Oh, there are so many things wrong with that. Where do we even start? I mean, for me, there's a higher level of issue of what kind of sovereignty do we want to surrender to the UN. So you could take the gun issue and the specific guarantees that we have through the Bill of Rights and go back to James Madison. And even back then, he acknowledged that we as a people, we were founded by armed citizens. And we have an advantage over a lot of nations in that we have the ability to defend ourselves with firearms. So anytime we enter into these international agreements that compromise our hard-won constitutional rights, and it's not just the Second Amendment, it's a multitude of rights. And something that also really concerns me are the First Amendment rights. We've seen all around the world, people are dying for speaking up about free speech. And there was a gentleman in Denmark who was a reporter or a newsman, columnist, a 70-year-old man. He went to the door to answer. He thought it was somebody delivering a package, and it was a young man who had a gun and tried to assassinate him. And fortunately, the young man was, I guess, I don't know, nervous, but he failed to assassinate this columnist. And you can just see that there are threats around the nation, around the world right now to all of our fundamental rights. So I have specific concerns about that particular agreement, but it's a broader issue. And if we just continue to surrender our sovereignty to these international groups, then we're not getting them back. I mean, once you let them go, you don't get them back.
I don't know if many people, I don't know if many people in the audience realize, and you're from D.C., that several years ago, and I wish I knew we were going to talk about this because I would reference the case, there were 4 women that were living together in a home in Washington, D.C. 2 men entered the home and started to violently rape 2 women at the bottom, at the lower level floor of the house. The other 2 women went upstairs to hide from these rapists. The police were called several times, passed the house, never did anything. It was the Washington, D.C. police. I wish I remember the case.
I'm familiar with it, yes.
Okay.
And the holding, the very disturbing holding.
Why don't you explain that case and explain to the people here in this audience what the result of that Supreme Court case was. And I would just like to make one other quote. Justice Joseph Story said, Second Amendment is the palladium of liberties.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to have to remember that one. Well, this is a case, I don't want to go into too many technical details, but it was really dealing with the issue of what duty does the police have to protect people. And so the question was, did the police officers violate their, I guess, basically fiduciary responsibility to these women and not respond to the crime adequately? Pardon me a moment. Let me get a sip of water. And I'm going to pull a Marco Rubio here.
Oh, that's terrible.
I'm in good company.
That'll be on the news tomorrow morning.
Yes, because they don't want to publicize anything else I have to say. That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, it was really fascinating because basically what the left, the anti-Second Amendment people, are trying to say is that we, the government, want to take complete control of your personal safety. And this is nothing that they aren't trying to do across a panoply of issues, of saying the government is responsible for your children, the government is responsible for your health care, the government is responsible for your self-defense. And in this case, and this really, it makes me really sad coming from DC, which has very dangerous neighborhoods. And you think of Chicago, you think of these towns that have politicians who witness this horrific, I mean, you think of the big mass shootings that everybody focuses on. Well, these cities have this happen all the time. It's just incremental. It's not all in one day. And the politicians in these cities are putting politics over public safety. And they are not defending, they're not allowing, it's even worse than that, they're not allowing the people to defend themselves. And who does it hurt the most? I mean, my focus in my speech and my testimony was on women and how disarming women is really dangerous for them. But the same could be said for people who live in dangerous neighborhoods. So these women in DC lived in a dangerous neighborhood, and the police did not respond adequately, did not defend them, did not, they couldn't prevent the attack, they didn't respond to the attack, and the women, because of the DC gun laws, really didn't even have the choice to defend themselves. And it's a perfect example when I had this statistic of over 90% of violent crime occurs without a weapon. And the left would really like to focus on the fact that in, like when they do their studies, the criminals aren't injured or killed. They don't count it if a woman just brandishes a gun. And plenty of times, all you need to do is brandish a gun, and the criminals go running because there are people who don't have guns, so they'll go to the next place. They don't want to take a risk like that, or they can fire shots. Although I would not recommend using the strategy that our vice president recommended.
Can you just tell the audience what the result of the case that went to the Supreme Court was? The Washington, D.C. police were held not liable,
right.
And that whole scenario went on for hours and hours, and eventually the two women that were in the upstairs rooms were raped by these two guys.
Right. I mean, it's a travesty.
And that was a Supreme Court case.
I think it was a D.C. I'm not positive this. I don't think it was maybe it was a Supreme Court case. I'm familiar with it, but I'm not sure which court heard it.
So they were not liable for not
yes.
protecting these women?
Yes, so we are not allowing women to defend themselves, and we're not holding the police to a standard of actually having to respond. And if you think about it, I've looked at response rates of the police. I heard last night at the fabulous forum that I attended, which kind of caught me up to speed on all of the things that you all are addressing and dealing with right now, that it could be 2 hours before the sheriff could get to you. And even in the cities, I've looked at response rates in DC, and the average response rate in the big cities are 11 minutes. And you look at these horrible things that happen, I mean, 11 minutes, that's an eternity if you're facing down a violent attacker. And these stories are just heartbreaking, but we can't let the emotion of certain stories distort looking at the facts of whether something, I mean, Obama particularly likes to have this line, and people on the left, of if we could just save one life. We have to pass this particular legislation because we could save one life. But if you look at the whole statistics, you could be saving one life and then lose thousands. I mean, that's very elementary, not very logical thinking in my book.
State your name, we're going to make your claims here.
Hi, I'm Robert Ball. I'd like to take exception to one comment you made. You were quoting statistics about 5 times as many deaths from physicians as from...
Are you a doctor?
Yes.
Okay.
You're comparing apples and oranges. Deaths from a gun are not accidentally, they're intentional. If there are medical deaths, the doctor didn't go, or the nurses or whoever didn't go into that situation to intentionally harm that person. And the number of physician, hospital-related encounters with patients is enormous compared to the number of encounters per day with a weapon. So you're really kind of quoting 2 different sets of statistics. to emphasize your point, and I don't think it's a valid comparison.
Well, let me shoot this back at you and see what you think. The point that I was trying to make with that is that these medical politicians are trying to scare people. When I had all my children, you would get a sheet when you'd go for the well child checkup. And one of the things it would say is, don't have a gun in the home. Just blank. And they felt like, the doctors felt like it was their role to tell people that. But there are statistics on the other side that would say, as a responsible mother, you should have the option to choose to have a gun, but you should also seriously consider having that and getting proper training, having it safely stored, making your children aware of, the NRA has a thing about stop and go tell an adult. And I think that's the point that I was trying to make, that medical politicians are trying to scare people about guns, when if they look at the real public safety crisis that they're experts at, it's negligence. So I'm not talking about whether doctors intend to hurt people or not hurt people. I assume they don't. But if they're looking, it's the idea of there's so many people dying from physicians' negligence, maybe they should fix that, like focus their energy on that.
Well, my only response would be, you've got to define medical negligence, and that's very easily done by lawyers.
Don't hold that against me.
No.
I don't do that kind of law.
Having been sued 4 times and never lost a case, I understand medical negligence. So it's in the eye of the beholder to some extent.
So I would be delighted for doctors to focus their attention on that. And tort reform is a really important thing, and I support that. So, that
So do I. I came from Texas.
Yes. But I think maybe you could see where the point that I'm trying to make, that doctors maybe put this information out there that's not completely considered, pediatricians in particular, and the ones who are out there using their, everyone admires doctors and they have a great voice in the community. And so they're given a lot of weight when they talk about these gun control issues. But if they look at the actual statistics and investigate it, not just come with their own bias and ideologies, maybe they would come to different conclusions, and maybe they should really, really focus hard on these negligence issues. But I'm just throwing it out there as something to think about.
Thank you. Well, first my little joke, and then I'll ask my question. I carry a gun because a policeman's too heavy.
Well, I haven't heard that one before. That's great.
But anyway, my question is, it's really addressing the issue of women and guns, that from my experience, I'm seeing more and more women are at the shooting range and getting concealed weapons
Yes.
units. And it's just really, it almost seems like they're starting to dominate the market, And I'm just wondering, is there a statistic for the growth in that, how many women are, or can you even find that out?
You can. I don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but the New York Times ran an article on this soon after my testimony, and I think my testimony, at least anecdotally, a lot of people have come up to me and said, wow, I never thought about it that way. I'm going to investigate this. I've had people say, I've gone out and bought an AR-15 based on what you said. I was not trying to recommend any particular method of self-defense or weapon of choice, but I think it has made people kind of question the narrative that's out there. And I think it would be pretty easy to look up on the New York Times website. I do know that the statistic that I said, that 2.2 to 2.5 million annual defensive gun uses. Of that study that they did, 46% of those who used the guns to defend themselves were women.
Right. It's like the image is changing because, I think that the gun control people are trying to picture some burly guy, who's
Yes.
obsessed with guns and all this. And
Yes.
the 65-year-old grandmother here. Okay.
I can actually answer the question because when I opened Elk River Guns in June of 1997, I actually went back and, 2007, excuse me. I looked at the 6 months of 2007 versus the same 6 months in 2012. 2007, women were 10% of my firearm sales. They are 33% of my firearm sales in this past year. So that's just a local trend.
Gail, Will Potter, one quick question. You talk about the UN. I guess we're going to have a similar problem as the Supreme Court becomes more liberal, or should they become more liberal?
You know, that's what I wrote in a piece right before the presidential election. And I said, do you want someone who's going to appoint justices who invent rights that are not in the literal text of the Constitution and try to airbrush out the rights that are actually written in the black letter text? Or do you want a president who can appoint justices that value the constitutional Bill of Rights protections that we all enjoy? So this is definitely something that we're going to watch. You know, decisions have consequences. Elections have consequences. Great question. They hate that. They really hate that. Well, it's interesting because the Independent Women's Forum, I went on Lawrence O'Donnell the night of the Senate hearing, and he just laid into me. He tried to derail me, and he was saying, you know, how can you be pro-life and you know, say that you're for women? And I hadn't said that I was pro-life. He was just trying to attack me any way that he could, and it just kind of, that was a microcosm of the women's groups that say they speak for all women, and they don't. They really don't. And so one of the things I said in my Senate testimony was, I speak on behalf of millions of American women who are urging you, legislators, to defend our right to choose. And that made them insane, because they said, you don't speak for all women. I didn't say that. You don't speak for, you know, the vast majority of women. I didn't say that. I said I spoke for millions. And they couldn't deal with that. So the Independent in the Independence Women's Forum, we don't all have the same opinions about stuff. So we have different views on different issues that come up. And the independent thing is that, you know, the National Organization for Women says that it speaks for all women. Well, we don't say we speak for all women. We say we speak for women who have, or who at least want to explore these ideas and not just accept what is being fed to them. And that was a great strength of the feminist movement, is that it had confidence in women and wanted to give them more choices. And it's kind of gone off the rails since then, and it has this rigid ideology that you have to subscribe to or you are culled from the herd. Right? Is that a good thing out here, like the ranching?
Wonderful presentation. I respect your point of view and your courage. There are some issues that I don't hear brought up that I'd like to point out, whether them up. I think they should become part of the debate. First of all, the Second Amendment does not grant a right. It guarantees non-abridgment of a pre-existing basic human right.
Yes.
And I don't see that said nearly often enough. Secondly, you can go back to what amounts to about the oldest known law on the globe, the Talmudic law. And it is not only a right, but a duty to defend self, family, and property. The Talmudic law. Ask any knowledgeable rabbi. There are so many others that just don't get out there. We need to go to a larger. I think that all the member nations of the British Dominion, Germany, Mexico, are violating basic human rights with their gun laws. I think we should go after them for that.
Well, first we have to preserve our own gun rights.
Another one is that I've seen knowledgeable legal scholars write that while the Constitution grants sovereign law status to a treaty that's ratified by the Senate, the Bill of Rights is senior even to that, and the treaty may not violate the Bill of Rights.
Well, a really troubling thing about that is liberal Supreme Court justices have started citing international law that we have not signed on to interpret our U.S. laws. And that is a very, very troubling development that we all should pay very close attention to.
Hi, thank you for being here. I just wonder if you maybe you can speak to the shortage of ammunition, and if manufacturers intend to try to meet the increased demand, because I don't know about anybody else, but I'm having a hard time finding it.
Government's buying it.
Every manufacturer in the country is running 3 shifts, increased quality control, volume. They cannot keep up with the demand. The typical demand year-round was being met by the industry. The backlog, I've heard different executives, say Remington, for instance, at one of the national shooting sports shows for dealers, talk about this was in mid-January, that the demand at that time compared to the prior year was 50-fold what the production capacity was. There is no way any industry, including the arsenal of democracy, the United States during both world wars, could ramp up fast enough to produce arms and ammunition at that rate. This is currently a public demand. There has also been there's a lot of misinformation about the Homeland Security ammunition purchase. That is a 5-year fulfillment, for one thing, that they're going for a bulk order, and it's multi-agency. It's not just the Homeland Security, but it covers many of the other agencies. A far more concern than they're needing practice ammunition is those several hundred armored personnel carriers for civilian use, what Homeland Security uses those for. But the industry as a whole is responding as best it can. This is an unprecedented demand. The strangest item of all is that 22 rimfire ammunition. Most gun owners own a 22 to plink with, or hunt rabbits, or target shoot, or use to keep themselves in good shooting form and competent, rather than burning up their expensive hunting ammunition, centerfire, more powerful ammunition for more serious uses. In 22, I've had, this is April, I would normally have sold 5 cases a month of 22 ammunition. I've seen 2 cases all year delivered. And I have a very good supply line, but it's strained to the limits. All these distributors and manufacturers are trying to get it out, but so the greatest likelihood is that civilians are buying and hoarding because they're afraid they won't be able to get it in the future, that it will be banned or rationed, because those are actually being talked about at the national level by certain legislators. So it's fueling a buying concern. You can use the word panic if you wish. That is unprecedented, and there's no way the industry can ramp up and maintain quality and deliver a good product. So they're doing what they can, but it's not nearly equal to the demand.
Okay, BJ?
I thought I'd let you know about a special woman that I knew. When she and her husband were first married, their car broke down outside of Meeker. He hiked back into town, and this was during the first oil shale boom we had around here. 5 drunks drove up in a pickup, started pushing on their little sports car. She was terrified. They were telling her all sorts of horrible things she would do. She reached under the seat and got her husband's gun that was there, and they said, "My God, she's got a gun!" And they left. When he got back, she was still shaking in tears. He took her out, showed her how to load it, and she started shooting. And she was the largest, most excellent person to teach women how to shoot this county ever had. Unfortunately, we lost her several years ago to a freak accident. But she had an awful lot of input of teaching women in this county how to shoot. Laura Farrell.
One more question.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, my name's Jim Payne, and I've been shooting since I've been a little kid. Lots of rounds, lots of guns and all that, and I watch things over generations. And my question to you, Gail, is where do you see all this going, let's say 3 years from now, with the gun legislation we have in Colorado now? And I feel we as hunters and shooters are just getting the daylight spanked out of us by all these people. I mean, it's really just going downhill fast. Where are we going to be in 3 years from now, do you think?
It's interesting. The Wall Street Journal had an article, I think it was last weekend, detailing states that have eased gun restrictions and states that have tightened gun restrictions. Now, Colorado obviously is one of the ones that has gone pretty firmly in the tightening the restrictions, but a lot of other states have eased restrictions. Some of the bills have been passed and are waiting for the governor to sign. So the Wall Street Journal was making the argument that all of this discussion, national discussion about this, it seems as though the gun restrictors are winning, but it might be more complicated than that.